Light Lisa.
Yeah, that worked.
Awesome.
There you go.
All right, I got to minimize myself. Otherwise, I'm going to be staring at my own face this entire time. Let's see. There, that's better. Okay.
All right, awesome. Welcome, Lisa. We're excited
Thank
to have
you.
Let's see. So our theme this morning is purpose, and we did break into groups and chat a little bit about how people's sense of creative purpose has changed within the last few weeks, if at all. Do you want to tell us how you feel about that question that you had all of us chat about?
Well, purpose is a really important part of my art practice, and I feel like part of what motivates me on a regular basis anyway is this sense of how I show up in the world. And the current circumstances have really caused me to rethink what my purpose is right now, because almost everything, not everything, but almost everything I was working on when this happened went to the wayside, was either postponed or canceled or sort of upended in some way. So I went through this period of enormous grief. I realize that now. I didn't realize it at the time. The first 2 weeks of quarantine, or whatever you want to call it, shelter in place, I was really struggling a lot with sort of how to feel, and found myself feeling really sad and exhausted. And in truth, I had literally just the day before wrapped up treatment for breast cancer. I was diagnosed with early stage breast cancer in December. And so January and February and the very early part of March were spent, you know, sort of in my own personal quarantine, if you will, having nothing to do with coronavirus. And so I was, I was ready to like break out and like go do things again and have energy again. And then all of a sudden, you know, actually Clay, my wife, and I were supposed to leave on vacation to Mexico. And so anyway, all of that aside, I had sort of this period where I had to really grapple with how I was feeling about letting go of all of these things that I was looking forward to. And I'm a person who really lives my life with a sense of purpose. I'm going to do this, I'm going to put this out into the world, and I'm going to work towards this, and I'm going to go do this. And I think Clay mentioned, you mentioned my cycling challenge already, but you know, that was like this thing that I was going to go do. And so I had to let go of either sort of changing my expectations slightly, and in some cases really profoundly, for what I was going to be working on and what I was going to be working toward. Clients were emailing me, my publisher emailed me and said, oh, this book that was supposed to come out this fall, it's now not going to come out until next year. This brand collaboration that we were going to launch in June is now not going to come out until February. And I understood why all this was happening, but it was incredibly hard to absorb all of this change happening at one time. So for about 2 weeks, I just sort of sat in this place of being really sad and grieving, for, not just for myself, but for everyone who was going through what I was going through, because I understood pretty quickly I wasn't alone. And then I sort of rallied myself and decided that I had to sort of think of a new purpose. I had to pivot. I had to think about, okay, all of these things that I was working toward that are now sidelined, what can I do instead? And how can I give myself permission to not be as prolific or as, you know, inspired as I normally am? Because that was another thing I recognized pretty quickly. And I wrote about that this morning on Instagram, this idea that stress can really zap our creativity. And we are in a time of unprecedented stress, not just each of us personally, but collectively. And that stress can there's a direct correlation, the research shows this too, between stress and creativity, and our inability to be creative or innovative when we're stressed. So so it was sort of like changing my expectations and pivoting my work. And so I can give you an example.
Yes, please.
I have a show that's opening here in Portland on June 6th, that Stephanie Chaffetz Projects, which is a gallery I've been working with for several years now. And I was so excited about this show because I have spent most of the last 2 years just working on commercial work and books. And I was gonna January 1st start working on this show and prepare all of this personal work, paintings and ceramics, and I'm even sewing a couple of quilts for the show. And I was so excited about this show. And so when I realized that it's possible I might not have an art opening that all my friends and fans can come to, that I might not even have a show, like I just didn't know how this was going to look. And so I quickly realized I had to make a choice. Do I talk to Stephanie and cancel my show? Or do I figure out, okay, this is the new reality. How do I prepare a show and how do we sort of like share that experience with people in a different way than we might have if people could come to the gallery? And what's interesting is most of the sale of my work and the viewing of my work comes from people all over the world because I have a pretty big online presence. And so this is something I probably should have done anyway, but Stephanie and I started talking about, okay, how can we videotape the show? My wife works for a VR company called The Wild here in Portland. And she was like, let's build a mock-up of the gallery in VR. And you can hang your show in virtual reality first, and then we'll go, so that you can do some of the work outside of the gallery, you can plan it ahead. And, and Stephanie and I are thinking about other ways that we can sort of share the work from the show, not just with people all over the world, but people in Portland. So I decided to still have the show. I had to think differently about the work that I was going to make because right now I feel a little wary about going to my studio because I share the building with several other people. I'm starting to go back now more with caution, but for a while I didn't want to go there at all. And I don't have room at home to make giant paintings like I would normally make. So I had to change, the size of the work I was making and think differently about the work in general that I was going to hang. So the show's still happening. Who knows whether or not people will be able to come to an opening. Maybe we'll have several openings and we'll limit the number of people, but there'll definitely be more online ways for people to view the work now. And so what that brought up for me was this sense of purpose, like, okay, I found something to work toward that feels exciting to me. And I'm working in with this constraint of like how we're kind of existing right now in the world. And I felt like I wanted to support my gallery by not canceling my show. She relies on the income from the sale of my work just as much as I do. And I also felt like it's important to continue for those of us who can to put work out into the world right now, because people are sort of grasping for any sense of, hope and positivity.
Oh, I love that. And there are so many lovely things in there. I really, if anyone has not read your metaphor about humidity and running and stress on Instagram this morning, oh, that made my day. Because I lived in DC for a while, and it is a completely different thing to go like try and exercise in that humidity versus the dry air over here.
Yeah.
It will just.
Yeah. And what Caitlin's referring to is this analogy I made between, everybody can go to my Instagram and read the post, but basically like I was suggesting that I told a story about how 5 years ago I went to upstate New York for an artist residency, and I had been running that summer in Portland all summer, and I had gotten up to a significant number of miles per week, and feeling really strong. And I go to upstate New York where it's like 75 degrees at 8 o'clock in the morning, and incredibly humid. And I go up not knowing that there was that humidity had any bearing on running at all, because I had never lived in a humid place, unlike you, Caitlin. And I go out for this run and I can barely get 2 miles without feeling like I'm going to die, basically. And so I just think that's such a great analogy, like that running in humidity, you know, that creating in times of stress is like running in humidity. You can do it. It just requires a lot more effort. And, you know, stress zaps our energy in the way that humidity zaps our energy. And it's important to remember that and to grant yourself some permission to go slower, to sort of walk through this. Or if you don't feel like being creative, you know, there's certainly things you can do to, I think, to sort of like structure creativity in your life during times of stress. But there's a certain amount of permission we all have to grant ourselves to slow down or not to do what we would normally do, because we just can't.
We can't. Yeah, it's really lovely to read, and it is a really apt analogy for just the unexpected way something like this is changing what people feel is their normal levels of productivity and creativity.
Yeah.
There's something else you mentioned, and hopefully folks who are familiar with your work, you talk often about how important discipline and routine and finding sources of inspiration and time for yourself, like time in your studio to work on your art, how important those are to your process, and seeking out, finding the spaces to seek out those times you're dedicating to your creativity, and times you're dedicating to going out in nature, going to other people's galleries, museums and things. And right now I feel like we're all kind of constricted into, we can't go work in a different space. We're
Right.
Our schedules are completely thrown off from even the most, you know, disciplined among us. And there's really like one place, which is the screen we're all staring at right now, or, you know, the endless scrolling that we're going to for inspiration. And so it just feels like we're online all the time and a little bit stuck in this kind of repetitive wheel. And it makes it harder than ever to stay out of those traps of feeling like comparing yourself to others, or feeling pressured to take on a creative project that maybe is outside what you can execute right now, or pressured to give back to your community. So, you know, just with all of those disruptions and things that make it harder to create balance now than ever before, how are you continuing to, you know, honor your path, stick to your routine as much as you can, or like in what ways are you allowing yourself to kind of make change within what's worked for you in the past?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question, because you're right. Normally, there's just ways that we manage our workloads or our stress. We can go out into nature, which we fortunately can still do. And I encourage people to get out and walk around where it's possible and legal, and as long as you're not trespassing, or trespass, whatever, do it. That feels like, you know, one thing that we can do. And part of what I'm doing is trying to focus every day on what I have control over, because we have control over a lot of things still. There's a lot more we don't have control over. So including knowing what's going to happen tomorrow. Not that we ever really knew what was going to happen tomorrow, but, you know, at this point, it's like we're all sort of looking at this future and we don't know what to expect. Like, even I was just talking about my show that opens in 6 weeks. Like, we don't know 6 weeks from now what the landscape is going to look like. And so part of what I've been doing is trying to focus on what I have control over. And part of this is different for everyone, but part of what gives me a sense of calm is creating a routine for myself. And my routine looks very different than it used to. I used to go to my studio almost every day. I got up and went to my local spin gym, mob cycle, you know, several days a week. 2 days a week, I would go on a really long bike ride with my cycling team. So, you know, all of that, it no longer exists. So I had to create a new routine for myself. And I think structure is actually really comforting to people. Even if you're somebody who feels like you're structure averse, sometimes the people who are structure averse actually tend to need structure even more than the average person. So, you know, I've been kind of creating a new routine for myself. I also think that I've been, and I encourage other people to think really simplistically about what you know, in those blocks of time that you're working in your day, like, what can I accomplish? What's reasonable for me to accomplish? And I mean, I'm sort of famous for having an impossible to-do list. And I'm really trying to pare that down to something that is actually possible, because it's something that I have control over. And literally, like, if I have a block of time in the morning, I actually, unlike many of you or other people out in the world, I actually don't have a ton of free time right now, because I actually am working on a bunch of client projects and one book, and I'm preparing for this show. So I have all this stuff I have to do. And if anything, I feel this pressure during this time when I feel stressed out about the unknown to be productive. And that's really hard. So for me, it's like, okay, in this 3-hour block of time that I have this morning, what can I reasonably accomplish? And really setting my goals to be less stringent than they normally would be, or sort of a little looser and slower than they would normally be. I work in short bursts more than longer bursts, if you know. And I think for anybody who is trying to show up creatively at, you know, their proverbial art desk or wherever it is that you make your work during this time, to think about, and is struggling to do that, to think about giving yourself an assignment that's really easy, in your comfort zone, something that is, you know, just requires showing up and doing something really simple. Because often it's just starting, that's the hard part. But once you get into it, you find yourself, you know, 3 hours later having created something. It was just the showing up and beginning that was the hard part. So making the beginning part of whatever it is you do easier for yourself.
Well, and I love the
So
idea. I love that you're not saying get rid of the to-do list. You're not saying just, you know, like, do whatever you're feeling. You're still holding yourself accountable, but giving yourself a little bit more of a little room to pare that back and make sure it's achievable and keep yourself going with that momentum.
Right. I mean, my work has always been about, like, my work is really like about, you know, sort of situated in what I am experiencing as a human being, as a woman, as a member of the LGBTQ community, you know, like as an artist. Like, those are all the things I make work about. I mean, some of my work has nothing to do with those things, but a lot of my work has to do with those things. And so what's happening now is a lot of my work has to do with what it's like to be in this time. So I also recommend that people sort of, like, consider where you are now. Like, forget where you were 2 months ago, forget where you want to be. Where are you now? What are you experiencing? And using that as, you know, the fodder for whatever it is you're going to make or write about, or even if that looks super different than what you would normally do. I mean, your imagination can be a very dangerous thing if you don't express it. So right now we're imagining all of these bad scenarios, or maybe we're imagining how this pandemic is going to change the world for the better, right? You know, that's probably a less dangerous direction to go. But one of the ways that you can deal with your imagination causing you anxiety is to express it, to write it down, to make art about it, to talk about it openly, because anything that isn't expressed is going to, like, fester inside of you. And so I've also been trying to, when I have anxiety about something related to what's happening in the world right now, I'm writing about it and I'm making art about it. And I started this early on. I posted about the pandemic before there were even any stay-at-home orders in the United States. And one of my followers suggested that she was going to start a coronavirus diary. That's what she called it. And I thought, that is such a great idea. So I started keeping one myself. And I don't post pictures of it most days on my regular feed and Instagram, but I post a photo of each of my diary entries every day in my Instagram stories. And I'm most of the time just writing about how I'm feeling or what I did that day or my fears or the things I'm grateful for, whatever. Sometimes I draw pictures. Twice now I haven't had anything to say, and I've drawn pictures of flowers one day and cats another. And then some days I just say, I don't have anything to say today. Yesterday's entry was literally hard pass. Like, I'm not,
Keeping
I
it
wasn't
real.
into it. Yeah. And that's the thing is like, even those days when you feel like you can't even write in your diary, that's nothing to be ashamed of. Like, that's part of your creative experience. Like, every block we have, every hard day, that's part of your story. That's part of what you're experiencing now. And that will come through in your work at some point, even if it isn't literally about that. Like, part of being a creative person is like, part of the beauty of being a creative person is that like we have this outlet for so much of what's going on inside of us. And so yes, it's harder now, but for so many of us, art is also survival. It's sort of how we deal with and grapple with like all of the stuff that happens in the world. And I don't just mean a global pandemic, I mean all of the stuff that gives us enormous angst.
Yeah. Well, that's, I think, a great point to bring up something that I think is a pressure that a lot of folks are feeling, because there's a difference between doing something like, a coronavirus diary, or continuing to work on things in your personal practice, or, like the paintings you're working on for your upcoming gallery show. There's a difference between those things, and there's this new weird pressure being put on creatives to like pick up a passion project and use all of this, time, allegedly unstructured time you have to produce something or learn something new, or just to do something that maybe you wouldn't otherwise have done. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of where this pressure comes from, why is it falling so much on the creative sphere, and the difference between what you're talking about, which is very, organic and internal creative work, and those external pushes for things you're publishing or sharing.
Yeah, it's such a great question. So there, one of my Instagram followers commented this morning, she said, I wrote this down, so I'm just going to read it. If I hear another person say Shakespeare wrote King Lear during the plague, I'm going to lose it. And I just thought that was so hilarious. And so then I Googled did Shakespeare write? And there's like a New Yorker parody that was written in early April about that. Like, it's a thing. And I actually wasn't aware of it until this morning, but and I just made me laugh. But that's really it. It's like, there is a lot of pressure not only to be productive and creative, like, oh, yay, you have all of this time now that you didn't have, which for many of us isn't actually true. We're still working full-time jobs and working on trying to finish projects. But for many people, it is true, right? And then for a lot of people, they're just trying to like raise their children at home. That's a whole other thing that I don't personally have experience with, but many of my friends are dealing with right now. And that is, talk about stressful. And then there's the pressure to do that stuff for other people, right? And so that was actually part of what I was experiencing in that first 2 weeks of quarantine, when I was really not in a good place, was like pressure I felt both from others and that I put on myself to not only be productive and make work, but to provide services and make other people feel better. You should make a coloring book page, Lisa. You should record a class. You should do this. You should do that. And I was also telling myself those things, right? And some of those things ended up happening. And I was really lucky because Adobe reached out to me and was like, do you want to make a coloring book page? And we'll host it and release it. And do you want to record a art class for kids? We'll host it and release it. Like, so I got to like do those things where I was contributing. And that did kind of like was a salve for me in terms of like making me feel a little bit better, because I think for a lot of us, there's also this like, how are you going to give back, right? Not just what are you going to do, but this pressure to like contribute to making masks and doing things for kids and donating money. And it's all very overwhelming. And I love that people are excited about making things and doing things for other people, but it also can be an enormous sense of pressure and stress. And so that was, both of those things were really, really hard. And I think that the pressure to be creative comes from, I think, this sense that that this misunderstanding that somehow and I think we all realize this in a way, right? Like there's all these projects that many of us have been thinking about for years. Like if I only had some time off, if I only had a sabbatical, if I only had time, I would do this, I would explore this. And then this time came for many people, and they had no desire or resources or energy to do that thing. And that's partly because what we were talking about earlier is that stress is literally decreases our ability to stay open and to express creativity, which is why it's really important in regular everyday life to try to relax as much as you can and counter your work with stuff that, you know, helps you release stress, because it's going to help your creativity in the long run, right? So so I think it's like this pressure that we all put on ourselves to do the thing that we've been dreaming about for all this time. That same residency that I went to in upstate New York 5 years ago was on the heels of, or in the middle of, a really crazy period of time for me. I was working on like 3 books at once and a bunch of client work, and I was put all of that aside to go on this residency. And I got there thinking, I'm going to be so productive making personal work. There was a show that was going to happen at the end of the residency, and I had 3 weeks to make as much work as I could. And I was so excited about it. And I got there and I literally had so much anxiety that I spent the first week just forcing myself to be creative. And this period of time feels similar, like for a lot of people, I think, like you think, oh, I'm going to have time and therefore I'm going to make. And yet we feel so paralyzed sometimes. And that's just because stress is, and grief and all of the things that we're dealing with, and loss of time and pay and all those things take such a toll. And that's why, you know, I often say, like, you know, it's important to sort of grant yourself some grace in this situation. Like, we all have to give each other and ourselves permission to not do what we had always imagined. This is not the ideal time necessarily. I think for some people, this is for some people in certain circumstances, this is going to be the most productive time in their life, or they're going to get in the best shape of their lives, right? Some people started like exercising, you know, good for those people. But for the vast majority of people, that's actually what most people are experiencing is the opposite of that. And that's just a universal thing. It's okay. And to not compare yourself to other people in terms of what other people's productivity or creativity is, because we're just in a time that no living person practically has experienced in the way that we're experiencing it. I mean, other horrible traumatic things have happened in the world, but nothing that every single person on the planet is experiencing at the same time.